He called the teen a thief in front of everyone, but when he saw him on the TV the next day wearing a medal and changing lives, he knew he was wrong. The old bell above the door gave a reluctant jingle as Jalen stepped inside. The air in Halberstam's market was cool, a welcome break from the thick, sticky heat outside. Dusty afternoon sunlight filtered through slatted blinds, casting diagonal stripes across the faded linoleum floor. A ceiling fan creaked overhead, turning slow like it was too tired to do its job properly. Jalen moved with quiet steps, his backpack slung over one shoulder, hoodie sleeves pushed halfway up his arms. He gave a small, polite nod to the man behind. The counter, Mr. Halberstam, the owner. Middle-aged, sharp-eyed, his lips pressed into a thin line. He gave nothing back but a stiff glance. The boy didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did, but chose not to react. He headed toward the back wall where drinks lined a refrigerator, fingers trailing the edge of a dusty snack aisle as he passed. His movements were slow, thoughtful. Eyes scanned shelves. He picked up a granola bar, turned it in his hand, read the back, then set it down. He wasn't in a rush, but Mr. Halberstam was watching, intensely. Behind the counter, he didn't bother to hide it. He leaned forward slightly, arms crossed over his chest. His eyes narrowed every time Jalen reached for something, even if only to read the label. There was a tension coiling in the room, quiet but undeniable, an invisible weight pressing down, between them. To the store owner, the signs were obvious. The bag, the hoodie, the slow movements. He'd seen this pattern before. Kids thinking they were slick. He'd been burned before, more than once. Lost stock. Broken trust. That's how he justified it in his mind as he stared, unblinking. Jalen finally walked up to the counter, placing a cold bottle of water in front of him. He reached into his backpack slowly, deliberately pulling out his wallet. That all? Mr. Halberstam's voice was curt. Yes, sir, Jalen said, his voice soft and even. There was no sarcasm, no attitude, just respect. Still, Mr. Halberstam didn't ring him up. Instead, he looked down at the backpack, then back at the boy. Open the bag, Jalen blinked, unsure he'd heard right. I'm sorry? The bag, the owner repeated, louder this time. Let's see what else you've got in there. For a long second, the room held its breath. The ceiling fan groaned again. The hum of a refrigerator somewhere in the back seemed deafening. Jalen looked around, saw a woman near the freezer section glance over, then look away just as quickly. His fingers tightened around the strap of his backpack. He didn't argue, he didn't even sigh. Slowly, he placed the bag on the counter and unzipped it. Inside, a physics textbook, a crumpled water bottle, 2 pens, a half-eaten apple wrapped in foil. That's everything, Jalen said, his voice steady. You're welcome to check it yourself. Mr. Halberstam stared into the bag for a long time. Longer than he needed to. Something in his jaw worked. He didn't apologize, didn't back down. He just scanned the water bottle and gave the total. Like the accusation had never happened. Jalen paid in cash, exact change, took the receipt, placed it inside his wallet with care. Then, before turning to leave, he looked the man in the eyes and said quietly, "Have a good day, sir." And then he was gone. The door jingled behind him, closing with a soft thud. Halberstam stood still, arms crossed again, watching the empty space where the boy had stood. Something gnawed at him, but he shook it off. It was just another afternoon, another kid who looked the part. He had every right to be cautious, didn't he? Still, he noticed the receipt lying on the counter, left behind, folded once, the ink slightly smudged from damp fingers. He picked it up, eyes lingering on the name printed across the top. Jalen T. Moore. He almost crumpled it, but for some reason, didn't. Outside, the sun continued to beat down on the quiet neighborhood. Cars passed by slowly, tires whispering against hot pavement. Somewhere, cicadas buzzed in the trees. Inside Halberstam's market, the fan kept turning, casting slow-moving shadows across the floor. And in the silence, a subtle tension still hung in the air, like smoke that hadn't quite cleared. The air in the store had turned heavier, though the fan above still clicked and turned lazily, as if unaware of the storm brewing below. Mr. Halberstam's voice hadn't been loud, but it had carried clear enough that the woman browsing the freezer section paused mid-reach, her hand hovering above a carton of eggs. Jalen stood still, one hand resting lightly on his backpack, the other holding the bottle of water he'd selected. His eyes searched the older man's face, not with fear, but with a quiet kind of hurt. "I didn't take anything," he said. His tone wasn't defensive, it wasn't even surprised. It was something worse, resigned. "Then you won't mind letting me check," Mr. Halberstam said, his voice sharper now. "People like you think I don't see things, but I do. I've seen this before." Jalen's brows drew together slightly, but he didn't flinch. He unzipped his backpack again, slow and careful, and turned it toward the counter. Its contents were the same: a thick textbook with curled corners, a few pens with chewed caps, and a tired-looking notebook. "I already showed you," Jalen said softly. But Mr. Halberstam wasn't finished. He leaned over and pushed the backpack, open wider, searching for... "What? A stolen granola bar, a pack of gum? I'm just protecting my business," he muttered. "You can't be too careful." A cough from behind them cut through the growing tension. The woman at the freezer was watching now, arms crossed. Behind her, a man with a toddler perched on his hip gave Mr. Halberstam a sharp glance. "He didn't take anything," the man said. "I was watching the whole time. The kid's just buying water." "That's not the point," Halberstam snapped, though he didn't look up. "I've had things go missing before. You think I'm going to let that happen again?" The store was small, the kind of place where silence echoed. Now that silence was filled with unease. Customers shifted uncomfortably. One woman picked up her basket and quietly left without buying anything. Another lingered near the door, unsure. Jalen zipped up his bag and placed it on his back again. Then he took out his wallet, worn at the edges, the leather faded. He counted out the exact change for the water and slid it across the counter. "I'm not trying to make trouble," he said. Mr. Halberstam's fingers hesitated over the coins, his jaw clenched tight. He rang up the bottle, handed over the receipt without a word. But Jalen didn't take it. Instead, he turned away, slowly, his movements measured. He paused at the door just a second, and then stepped outside. The door jingled faintly behind him, then fell silent. No outburst, no curse. Just quiet disappointment that somehow echoed louder than a scream. Halberstam stood frozen behind the counter, staring at the receipt still resting there. Jalen T. Moore, printed neatly across the top. He didn't crumple it, didn't throw it away. He just stared. Outside, the sunlight was glaring. Jalen walked with his shoulders slightly lower than before. He took a sip of water and didn't look back. Back inside, the customers dispersed. The man with the toddler gave Mr. Halberstam one last look, something between disbelief and disgust, before walking out. The woman from the freezer aisle murmured under her breath, "Shameful," and followed suit. Now the store was quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet as before. It was thick, uncomfortable. The hum of the refrigerator felt louder. The fan creaked above like it too disapproved. Mr. Halberstam turned away, fussing with a display of gum by the register, hands trembling slightly. He told himself he was right, that he had to be careful, that you never knew. But the way the boy had looked at him, that silence, that calm, gnawed at something in him. Not guilt, not yet, but discomfort, doubt. He picked up the receipt again. Jalen's name printed so clearly, the change counted so neatly, the eyes that had never dropped in fear, never flared with rage. And then he realized what unsettled him most. The boy had not tried to prove his worth. He had let the man assume the worst and still walked out with dignity. That kind of strength was harder to ignore. The hum of the refrigerator in the back room was nearly hypnotic. Mr. Halberstam sat at the small fold-out table he used as a makeshift lunch corner, unwrapping the foil from his tuna sandwich with hands that moved more out of routine than hunger. A paper cup of lukewarm coffee rested beside him, forgotten. The old TV mounted in the corner, screen grainy, volume low, was tuned to the local news as it always was during his break. He chewed slowly, his eyes half-focused on the screen, until a name broke through the static of his thoughts. Jalen Moore, a 17-year-old student from Edison High School. His hand froze mid-air, sandwich inches from his mouth. On screen, the image sharpened into a familiar face. Jalen stood before a small crowd at a local university science hall. The backdrop read, "Youth Innovation for Global Change, Regional Recognition Ceremony." Around his neck hung a gold medal with a blue ribbon, gleaming softly under the auditorium lights. A professor in a grey blazer stood beside him, beaming with pride. Mr. Halberstam put the sandwich down. The reporter's voice was warm, almost proud. Jalen Moore, who has been working on this project since last summer, developed a low-cost portable water purification system designed specifically for disaster-stricken areas and low-resource communities. The camera zoomed in on the device, a compact, durable-looking kit no larger than a lunchbox, with filters and tubing organized inside like clockwork. The prototype, the professor chimed in, has already been tested by 3 non-profits, including one responding to the Jackson, Mississippi water crisis. Mr. Halberstam leaned forward. His eyes, dry from the stale air of the store, didn't blink. "He's one of the youngest national winners we've seen in over a decade," the reporter continued. "And what stood out most? His quiet dedication, his humility. His words today struck a chord with many." Cut to a clip from the ceremony. Jalen stood behind a microphone, his voice soft but steady, just like in the store. "I just wanted to build something useful. My mum always said, if you can fix a problem, you shouldn't wait for someone else to do it, even if no one's watching." A ripple of applause followed. The screen flashed back to the studio. The anchors beamed, full of praise. "It's youth like this that remind us. Brilliance often comes from the most overlooked corners. Congratulations, Jalen." Mr. Halberstam didn't hear the rest. His mind had drifted back to the day before, the way Jalen had opened his backpack, calm and unflinching. The way he had left the receipt on the counter without a word. The shame that had flared in the air, like static, sharp and invisible. He pushed the sandwich away, appetite gone. The door to the main store jingled faintly, a customer entering. But he stayed seated. On the TV, the segment ended and moved on to sports scores. But the room still felt full of Jalen's voice, of his composure. "Even if no one's watching," the phrase echoed like a quiet rebuke. He thought of the backpack, the scuffed corners, the weight of books, the quiet discipline that had radiated from the boy. And still he had chosen suspicion. Not because of evidence, not because of theft, just because Mr. Halberstam rubbed his face with both hands, suddenly tired in a way that felt deeper than his bones. This wasn't the first time he had followed. A hunch. He had told himself it was caution, that he was protecting his store, his livelihood. But the truth was sharper. He hadn't seen Jalen, not really. He had only seen the hoodie, the skin, the silence. And now, on a flickering screen in a cluttered backroom, he saw what he had failed to see in person. Intelligence, purpose, dignity. He sat there for several minutes, the sound of the register faint through the wall. The coffee had gone cold. The sandwich sat untouched. A small quiet pit grew in his chest. Regret. Not the loud kind, the one that comes with shouting and slammed doors, but the kind that settles like dust. It didn't shout. It whispered. He slowly stood up and walked toward the counter, his steps heavy. Outside, the sun glared off the windshield of a passing car. In his store, beneath the flicker of fluorescent lights, Mr. Halberstam found himself wondering, not for the first time that day, what else had he failed to see? The receipt Jalen had left yesterday was still there, tucked beneath the edge of the register. He pulled it out, unfolded it carefully, and read the name once more. Jalen T. Moore, a name that now meant far more than he'd allowed himself to imagine. The afternoon light slanted through the dusty blinds, cutting the store into quiet stripes of gold and shadow. Mr. Halberstam stood alone behind the register, the world outside moving slowly. A child pedaled past on a bike. A dog barked somewhere. Down the block, and the fan above hummed like it always did, stirring stale air but offering little comfort. He hadn't been able to stop thinking about the news broadcast. Jalen, standing proud and humble at once, a medal shining on his chest. That voice, soft, precise, purposeful. Every word from the teen the day before now replayed with new weight, amplified by understanding. Every suspicion, every sideways glance, every unspoken assumption. They all felt heavier now, like stones dropped into his conscience one by one. The store was quiet, save for the occasional beep of a barcode scanner or the click of a distant cooler door. No rush today, just space for his thoughts to echo. Mr. Halberstam's fingers drifted toward the edge of the counter, brushing against something, tucked beneath the register drawer. It had been there since yesterday, slightly crumpled. He'd meant to throw it out, but something now compelled him to pick it up again. The receipt. The ink had faded slightly along the top from the heat of the machine, but the item was still clear water bottle, 129s. Beneath that, his own scrawled signature half formed from habit. Nothing remarkable until he turned it over. On the back, in neat small handwriting, were 6 quiet words. Sometimes we see what we expect. Then below, another line, written more slowly, as if the writer had hesitated. I hope next time. You look a little harder. Halberstam froze. The paper trembled slightly between his fingers, not from a breeze but from the subtle twitch of his hand. The note wasn't bitter. It didn't accuse, it didn't lash out like he might have expected from someone wronged so publicly. It was just honest, undeniable. He reread it once, twice, a third time. The words hit harder than if Jalen had screamed. In his face, they carried the weight of dignity, the ache of being seen wrongly, judged prematurely, and yet they also held hope. A challenge, yes, but not a cruel one. Dare called to do better. He sank onto the stool behind the register, the receipt still in hand. The sharp clatter of the stool legs hitting the floor startled even him. It echoed in the stillness like a verdict. His gaze drifted to the door, half expecting the boy to walk in again. But of course he wouldn't. Not today, maybe not ever. Look a little harder, the note had said. He thought back to the moment Jalen had walked in, hood up, backpack slung low, eyes on the shelves. Polite, quiet. But all he had seen was a pattern, a statistic, a stereotype, and that had been enough. Now he imagined the same teen hunched over a cluttered desk somewhere, sketching out blueprints for a device that might one day save lives in places most people never thought about. He imagined the long nights, the broken parts, the trial and error. And through all of it, Jalen had carried not just the burden of invention, but the burden of perception. The store owner stared at the note again, and this time the edges felt sharper. Not because the boy had been cruel, but because he hadn't. The restraint, the control, the grace, that's what made it cut so deep. He looked around the store, the chipped linoleum tiles, the flickering fluorescent light near the soda fridge, the faded no shoplifting sign near the door. It all felt smaller now, like it belonged to a world that hadn't grown, even as everything outside it had. He folded the receipt carefully, smoothing the creases like it was something fragile. For a brief moment, he considered tossing it into the trash. Maybe it would be easier not to think about it again, to write it off as an overreaction, but he didn't. Instead, he reached under the counter, pulled out a paperclip from the cluttered drawer, and pinned the receipt to the corkboard behind the register, between old invoices and lotto winner photos. He placed it deliberately at eye level, a daily reminder, not of guilt but of growth. He stood still for a moment, hand resting on the edge of the counter, eyes locked on the note. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent, turning the street gold. A couple walked past, their shadows long on the sidewalk. The world moved on, but something inside the store, inside him, had shifted. He didn't know if Jalen would ever return, but if he did, Mr. Halberstam knew now. He'd see him. Really, see him, and that made all the difference. The fluorescent lights of the community center buzzed overhead, a low electric hum that mingled with the chatter of families, the clatter of folding chairs, and the excited bursts of applause from children presenting their projects. Posters lined the walls, colorful displays of science, innovation, and hope. Mr. Halberstam stood just inside the entrance, clutching his worn cap in both hands. He hadn't planned to come. For hours that morning, he paced behind his counter, staring at the receipt, pinned to the corkboard like a wound he didn't know how to dress. But something in him refused to stay away. He didn't wear his store uniform today. No name tag, no shopkeeper's apron. Just a simple grey jacket and khaki slacks, trying to blend in with the crowd. He didn't want to be recognized, not by the organizers. And certainly not by the boy he had misjudged so badly. From the corner of the room, partially hidden behind a table stacked with brochures, he spotted Jalen. The boy stood beside a tall display board, sleek, well organized, with diagrams and photos that explained the portable water purification system he'd engineered. A small plastic model sat on the table, tubes and filters arranged neatly, humming softly as it filtered murky water into a clear cup. Children crowded around in awe. Parents leaned in with impressed murmurs. Jalen answered every question patiently, his tone confident yet humble. His eyes lit up when he spoke about rural communities, emergency aid, and clean water access. He wasn't just proud of what he'd built. He believed in what it could do. Mr. Halberstam's throat tightened. He had accused this kid of stealing a bottle of water. He remembered how calmly Jalen had stood his ground. No defensiveness, no raised voice, just quiet disappointment. And that note, those words still echoed, shaping the silence now settling in his chest. He stayed for nearly an hour, lingering at the edges of booths, pretending to read other projects, but always drawn back to Jalen. Watching, learning, listening. Not once did he approach the boy. Not once did he expect to be forgiven. That night, back in his store, he sat behind the register long after closing. The lights were dimmed, the aisles quiet, and the receipt still hung where he had left it. But something else stirred in him now. Not just guilt, but responsibility. He reached under the counter for his old checkbook. The last time he had written a donation, it had been for a charity raffle 10 years ago. He scribbled a number, not large enough to impress, but more than enough to help, and signed it with a name he hadn't used in a while. A friend of the future. No return address, no explanation. He sealed the envelope, addressed it to the community center's science program, and dropped it in the mailbox the next morning. Later that same day, as the late afternoon sun poured golden light through the store windows, Mr. Halberstam stood near the front entrance, staring at a small plastic sign taped to the glass. No backpacks allowed. He had placed it there years ago, after a rash of shoplifting incidents. Back then, it had felt like a precaution. Nothing. Personal, just business. But now he saw it for what it was, a message written in assumptions. He peeled it down slowly, the old adhesive leaving behind a faint shadow on the glass. He didn't replace it. The bell above the door jingled a moment later. A boy walked in. No. Older than Jalen. Same quiet manner, same alert eyes. He wore a backpack worn and sagging, and paused as if expecting to be stopped. Mr. Halberstam nodded gently. "Afternoon," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Let me know if you need help finding anything." The boy blinked, surprised by the welcome, then nodded and wandered into the snack aisle. It was a small moment, barely a ripple in the day, but for Mr. Halberstam, it was a beginning. That night, he didn't take the receipt down from the corkboard. He left it there, still pinned between reminders of invoices and winnings, not as penance, but as purpose. Because sometimes change doesn't come in loud declarations or sweeping gestures. Sometimes it starts quietly, in the pause before an eye. Assumption, in the stillness of learning, in the simple act of looking a little harder. And for the first time in years, as the store settled into silence and the sun dipped below the rooftops, Mr. Halberstam felt the weight of the day lift just enough to breathe. The days rolled on as they always did. The hum of the old refrigerator in the back of Mr. Halberstam's store blended with the gentle jingle of the front door, the quiet conversations between neighbors, the rhythm of routine. But something had changed. Not in the world outside. The street still bustled during school dismissals. Mothers still hurried in for last-minute groceries. Kids still eyed the candy rack like it held the secrets of the universe. No, the shift happened within him. Quiet like sunrise. Slow like thaw. It wasn't just about Jalen anymore. It wasn't about guilt or even redemption. It was about awareness. He found himself watching differently now. Not with suspicion, but curiosity, respect. When the next teen wandered in with headphones in and a slouch that once would have triggered alarms in Mr. Halberstam's head, He didn't narrow his eyes or follow them down the aisle. He simply greeted them and listened. Sometimes they spoke back, sometimes they didn't. But the wall between them was no longer being silently built brick by brick through glances and assumptions. Mr. Halberstam still ran his store with caution, as anyone with a small business must. But the caution was no longer rooted in fear, it was grounded in fairness. He kept the note from Jalen, copied in his own neat handwriting now, tucked inside the register. Sometimes we see what we expect. I hope next time you look a little harder. He didn't display it for customers, didn't flaunt it like a badge. It was his quiet reminder of the moment he almost lost his own humanity to a false certainty. And from time to time, on slower afternoons, he'd find himself wondering where Jalen would go from here. The prototype the boy had showcased at the community center was already gaining traction online. A video interview had gone viral, and donations had started pouring in from people across the country who saw potential, not just in the machine, but in the mind and heart behind it. Jalen wasn't just smart. He was visionary, the kind of young man people would one day call doctor or professor, or maybe even leader. And Mr. Halberstam, he had almost reduced him to trouble. It wasn't an easy truth to carry, but it was necessary, because prejudice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers through routine, through warnings disguised as policies, through glances that last a beat too long, through the stories we tell ourselves before giving someone else the chance to speak theirs. He thought back to that moment, Jalen, standing still, his backpack open, his voice steady despite the humiliation. There had been no anger, no yelling, no storming out, only quiet dignity, the kind that forces you to confront yourself when all the noise dies down. And now, whenever Mr. Halberstam caught his own thoughts drifting toward judgment, he asked himself, am I seeing the person, or the fear I've been taught to expect? That question, simple, sharp, had reshaped him. It reminded him that we don't always get second chances to treat people right. Sometimes the moment passes, and all that's left is the sting of regret, or the silence that follows an apology never made. But we always get a choice to pause, to judge less, to listen more, to see beyond what we've been told to. Fear, that choice doesn't erase the past, but it can rewrite the future, one interaction at a time. Mr. Halberstam's store would never be the center of town. It wasn't the kind of place that made headlines or drew crowds, but for those who walked through its door now, something was different. A warmth lingered where cold glances once chilled. A welcome waited where suspicion once stood guard. And that mattered, because kindness too can be quiet. It doesn't need applause. It only needs intention. He knew he'd never be the hero of Jalen's story, but maybe, in his own quiet way, he'd stopped being the villain of someone else's, and that, he thought, was a start.